house, and I am so glad that you're here as we're continuing our study on evangelism. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the most important components and often missed components of the role of the pastor, and that is the pastor as the cultural anthropologist. The good news of Jesus Christ is always communicated through cultures. Cultures include symbols, include language, include different understandings of power dynamics, different modes of gathering and fellowship. And if we think about how the gospel has been passed down for centuries, well, it's always been translated into new languages as it encountered new languages. It has, we see Paul referring to the unknown God as a cultural analogy to be able to connect with the people in Athens. We understand that today it's essential for us to understand the culture in order to communicate the good news of Jesus Christ. So today we are going to be talking about the pastor as cultural anthropologist. So here we go. So we're going to talk about introduction to cross-cultural appointments. Now, if you feel you're not in a cross-cultural church, and if you're from a non-appointive system, don't let that distract you. Stay with me, and you will see that this applies to you. The pastor is the cultural anthropologist, developing cultural competencies, and before we get to the point of creating a new culture. So every appointment, I want you to know every appointment, every charge, every calling to every church is a cross-cultural appointment. Now, again, I want to say for those that are not in the appointment system, don't let that term scare you off. But just every church that any pastor serves is a cross-cultural service, and I will explain more here. Because every church has its own culture. No two churches have the identical culture. For example, here in Dallas, we have Walnut Hill, Lovers Lane, Cochran Chapel, all three United Methodist churches, all three within 3 miles of each other in Northwest Dallas, all serving very similar mission fields and located in very similar neighborhoods. But all three of them have very distinct cultures. In the southern sector of Dallas, we have St. Paul United Methodist Church, Warren United Methodist Church, St. Luke Community United Methodist Church, all historically African American or Black churches. And each one of those three, although they have some similarities and perhaps more similarities than they do with the three churches in Northwest Dallas, they too have their own cultures. We have 4 white churches in the town of Greenville, a town of 26,000. And each one of those churches, for those who are familiar with those churches, they have distinct cultures. And anyone who's spent any time in the church knows that every single small group in the church, whether it's Sunday school class, the youth group, the different UMW or women's groups, they all have their distinct cultures as well. And then we have our mission fields around our churches, which are made up of many cultures and have their own distinctions, cultural distinctions as well. So we need to think of culture along a spectrum and in many containing many different aspects that make up a culture. And oftentimes culture and race get conflated. Although race and culture often overlap in many areas, they are two distinct things. And so understanding that, for example, someone who may be white and from southern Louisiana has a very distinct culture than someone who is white and from born and raised in San Francisco, for example. So, so sometimes the cultural heritage and the cultural experience of clergy in the congregation are more homogeneous, and so that's what I was saying. If you, if you feel like you're not in a cross-cultural appointment, because probably there is a lot of overlap. But um, and while in others it's very distinct, you can see that okay, yes, they're obviously not from the culture where they're now serving. Um, I will go back and still reiterate. Uh, we are serving in distinct cultures when we are serving in our churches. And so, talking about how broad are differences within cultures. So, I learned Spanish mainly as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador, and would come to serve in a community planting La Fundición de Cristo in Northwest Dallas, which was mainly at that time northern Mexican culture in that neighborhood. Now, obviously, Ecuador and northern Mexico share the Spanish language, but then I soon discovered that there was a certain word that we used in Ecuador that was a very offensive and bad word in Mexico, and so I had to get rid of that in my vocabulary. I also saw how there's an urban rural connection, and so in ways I had much more connections with being from a rural area with the Mexicans who came from rural areas than some of my friends who were from urban areas in Mexico who did not relate as much to those who were from rural areas. And so understanding that culture is much more broad and dynamic than race. So here we have, using the example, we have two groups of Latinos but who have very distinct cultures among them, but yet also I have a rural culture that would overlap with the culture of people from rural Mexico. So now let me share with you the great cultural faux pas of the nativity set. So in Ecuador, the family I was with, they had a nativity set. My mom has many nativity sets that she puts out every year. So for me, in my culture, a nativity set is simply decoration. And so when we had a donor of Christ's Foundry, La Fundición de Cristo, come and offer a large, beautiful, expensive nativity set, well, I gladly received it and gladly put it up in the church where I served as decoration. Well, one of the church members who had come from Mexico, who had come out of a Roman Catholic church, uh, came up to me and says, "Pastor, we cannot have these up in the church. People are kneeling and praying to these. There are people who are coming through our building and they are kissing the baby. Uh, we can't have this in our church. I came out of this. We're not Catholic because it's a United Methodist church." Well, I could have gone to great efforts to tell her that, well, there's nothing wrong with it, that it is just decoration and make a deal about. But instead, I said, well, there's the box they came in. Feel free to pack them up, because I could tell that it was causing her to stumble. And so, even within the Mexican culture, whereas there was some persons who really embraced the nativity set, it was obviously a stumbling block for this church member, and so to adapt to that culture, then she was giving me some cultural insight. Uh, we had we went ahead and took the nativity set down. Another example is what you should be called. So when I was growing up in Henderson, Texas, in rural East Texas, when I think back about it now, I find it kind of weird. I had to call every adult Mr. or Mrs. and then their last name, but for some reason we were allowed to call our pastor by the pastor's first name. Uh, and so coming out of that culture, not knowing any better, when I started planting La Fundición de Cristo, I told people, call me Owen, because that's what we always called our pastor when I was growing up, and it was what we called our pastor at Lover's Lane, where I had served before going to La Fundición de Cristo. We called him Stan. Well, that one day, one of the parents uh, approached me and asked me to stop teaching her her children to call me Owen, because by calling me just by my first name, they saw it as an act of disrespect to me. An act that, although I didn't feel disrespected, I was disrespecting their pastor, and I was teaching their children what they saw as an act of disrespect. And so I have heard cases where pastors were greatly offended when they stepped into another culture and were being called something different. I want to encourage you to both seek to culturally adapt as well as let people know by what name you wanted to be called. I ended up going by Pastor Owen when I step into the building today and go back and visit. Everyone still calls me El Pastor or Pastor Owen. And so you can think about what is it culturally appropriate for you, as well as what is culturally appropriate for your context. But I want to encourage you to lean into your context and understand where they are coming from as you're seeking to connect with that congregation. And I put down at the bottom, do I just go by just Owen or Pepe Jose? That comes from when I was in the Peace Corps. I lived with a family, and they said, "You got a phone call today, but we didn't know it was for you because we don't know your name. We can't say your name. And what is your Spanish name?" Well, there's not really a Spanish translation for Owen. And I told them when my high school Spanish class, I went by Pepe. And so they said, "Pepe Jose, that is what we're going to call you." And so they called me Pepe Jose. And when I got to the community where I served for 2 years in the Peace Corps, a few people, I told them they could call me Pepe Jose. But as people got to know me more and I got to know them more, they said, "Well, what is your name?" And I said, "My name is Owen," but some people have trouble with that. And more people says, "I will learn how to say your name." So when entering into a new culture, again, seek to adapt to that culture as much as you feel comfortable and as much as you feel safe. And with time, as they get to know you and get to love you, and as you love them, we will see that new cultures emerge, and in that new culture, sometimes new names uh, come together. So once again, treat every church that you're serving and every community that you're serving as a cross-cultural appointment. So a few words of warning. Cultural assumptions are inevitable. You're always, as you're looking at people as a mission field that you're seeking to reach, you have to operate off of some assumptions when you're interacting with people. But also know that cultural assumptions can be dangerous. So enter into new cultures, into new communities with a humble spirit. Also remember that every culture, all cultures, are created by people. And no person except for one has been without sin. So we know that no culture is without sin, and at the same time, there's beauty and goodness that can be found in all cultures, just as sin can be found in all cultures. So, um, so again, during this time, you've received many words of wisdom of how and when to call out sins. Just remember that it's calling out sins of a culture early on can be very detrimental, just as calling out sins to someone you don't know, who doesn't know that you care about them, can be detrimental. But when people believe that you love them and you appreciate them, then they're much more open to correction. So let's move to part 2, the pastor as the cultural anthropologist. Different aspects make up culture. They value different things, they hold different values, uh, different community relationships, programs, politics operate in different ways. Uh, they each have their own stories that they share and pass through. Uh, when we talk about language, it goes beyond just English or Spanish or Portuguese or Japanese. Language also includes the formality of language and how it's used, gestures that are used to communicate as well. There are traditions and rituals in all cultures and in all churches. I was joking with a friend this past week about churches that consider themselves non-liturgical often develop their own liturgies that they all follow. They may not be where everybody stands and recites something, but they usually fall into a pattern of their worship or what they do, and those are as much liturgies as the liturgies of old. Techniques and skills. What is the congregation good at? The tools, objects, money, and economics. What again? Uh, each community has their own means of operating, and what arts, what music, what symbols, and then how do they gather? How do they fellowship with one another? One of the means of analyzing culture is using this dimensions of culture. So, culture and different dimensions of culture are best seen on a spectrum. And so, as we go around this spectrum, we can explore: is this culture more individualistic, or is it more collective? Is greater importance placed on individual privacy, on individual choice, or is it more of what is good for the community is good? So again, different communities, different cultures, and even different churches emphasize this individualist versus collectivist spectrum. Is it task oriented? Is it about getting the job done? Think about corporations that value getting the work done. Focus on your job. Is it more task oriented, or is it more relationship oriented? This way may not be the most efficient, but it's best for the relationships involved. Analyzing that task versus relationship spectrum. How do they communicate? Is it a much more direct communication, or is it more indirect? Do you have to listen for subtleties, nuance, or are people communicating in a very direct way, in some ways that maybe in some cultures people would find offensive or be taken back at such directness? And again, we must communicate the gospel in the culture that we are seeking to reach. Is the power structure more valuing more equality or more hierarchy? And I would say cultures also shift in that. So in times of uncertainty, in times of crisis, um, um, even a culture that really values equality can really shift into the valuing hierarchy because of the need of having quick, assertive action. And so, but analyzing on which the culture, on where it falls in the spectrum, and in the season in which that you're doing the analysis. Is it more future oriented or more past oriented? Most of our churches are past oriented. They have symbols that point to the past. They have pictures in their church that point to the past. Oftentimes, when we're telling stories of the gospel, we are pointing to the past. And if we look throughout scriptures, we have lots of remembrances of looking to the past. But we also have lots of references about looking to the future. But whereas we, as pastors, we're usually wanting to come in and have people looking to the future. We want to be casting vision. That may not be the posture of the church, and I'll talk a little bit more about working within this past-oriented culture to get churches to look into the future as we move forward. Universal versus situational, meaning how much do we feel like our values or what we believe is more universal, or approaching things from this is just how it is? Or do we see as, well, this is how it is in this situation right now, and being much more situational, much more contextual? Where is the thinking and posture of your community that you're working in. Again, verbal, nonverbal, was a little bit of in the direct and indirect conversation. But as far as um, there are there are communities that are much more expressive with nonverbal communications, and other communities that are much more expressive with verbal communications, informal and informal, and this uh, goes beyond dress. This goes beyond worship styles. It's also how you address persons. In a formal culture, in informal settings, I am called Dr. Ross. In much more informal settings, I am called Owen. And in some congregations, they want their pastor if they hold a doctorate, or they want them being called reverend. But others are much more informal, and such formal titles are foreign to their culture. And so here's just a helpful tool to be able just to analyze both, not just the culture of the congregation where you are, but also the culture of the mission field that you are seeking to evangelize. Another tool is Hofstede's Dimensions of Culture. There are a lot of resources on the internet. Just Google the Hofstede Dimension of Culture, and using that, some of that is a repeat of what I just did, but it's also another helpful tool as you're seeking to analyze the cultures in which you've been charged to share the gospel. So now moving into part 3. Moving from just becoming aware of the cultural dynamics in which you are operating to then becoming competent to effectively communicate and work in those cultures. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about developing cultural competencies. Here's a spectrum from Mainsail Partners. And I appreciate it, and I've added some terms at the bottom that will kind of for our purposes here. And you see where it starts off as cultural destructiveness. We've seen many missionaries throughout history fall into this. I've seen many pastors in my day fall into a cultural destructiveness because they are forcing their culture or their understanding of what the culture should be upon their congregation or upon the mission field that they're trying to reach. And when I say this, oftentimes you'll see church pastors come in and says, well, this is what I did at my last church, or this is what I've done in every church. And so they come in without respecting or assimilating to the culture in which they've been sent, and seek to impose a foreign culture upon them. And generally, that is destructive, whether that's done to a minority group or whether it's done to the majority group by a domineering pastor or by some domineering laypersons. So moving along the spectrum, that goes from being destructive to being just incapable. And one easy lesson is someone who goes to minister and does not even know the language of the people that they are sent to serve. They are just incapable. In other aspects, we've seen in the progressive and conservative divide, both the political divide, the theological divide, are just perspectives in general. Seeing a real conservative or progressive pastor serving in a congregation or in an area that is quite contrary to their beliefs or orientation, and when the pastor does not adapt and their approach, they're usually ineffective, often destructive, but in the end ended up just being incapable of communicating the gospel in those cultures, because the cultures are just so foreign to them and they've not taken enough time to learn and understand those cultures in a way that would then enable them to be effective in communicating the good news of Jesus Christ. And we all have blindnesses, and so it's not that we're necessarily incapable, we just don't know. Kind of like my nativity set. I just didn't know. I was culturally blind to how that would affect people. But fortunately, the Lord sent someone like Aaron, who oriented Moses to the Israelite culture, the Lord had sent someone to orient me into the culture where those nativity sets were unhelpful. So I'm hoping by the end of today that we are all at the minimum on the cultural pre-competence phase, knowing that there is a lot we don't know about where we are wanting, about the people with whom we are wanting to share the gospel. To be in that posture of learning. So this is where we're sharing the pastor as the cultural anthropologist in the posture of learning. And the more you learn, the more you become competent at operating in those cultures to the point where you become proficient. And once you're becoming proficient, you're enabled to start developing a new culture, not just in the congregation, but a culture that permeates beyond the congregation and into the community where you serve. So pastors, we must be able to build effective relationships, which takes cultural competencies. We must effectively extend pastoral care in the culture to those we are sent. Leading by consensus, navigating local church politics, economics, and concerns all takes cultural competencies. Conduct key leader engagements, effectively operate in a complex environment, not just the church, but also in the mission field. And as always, communicate in and through the culture of the congregation and the mission field. So here's another spectrum that you can seek to look at. Going from denial there's no, that just denying that there's another culture, denying that you're trying to impose your culture. Again, that denial is destructive. Or moving to polarization. My way is the right way, or my culture is better than your culture. And history is full of evil people doing evil things in the name of believing that their culture is superior to the culture of others. But as we know, and as I've pointed out, all cultures have beauty within them, and all cultures also have sin within them. And I know from experience, I know from observation, that it's always easier to point out the specks in the cultures of others than it is to often notice the logs in the eyes of our own cultures. So the next on this spectrum is the minimization. Oh, it's really not that different when these differences are important. To acceptance of differences, and again, to adaptation, being able to adapt to be able to effectively serve. And just a word of warning, we want you to develop the cultural adaptations, but to keep yourself and your family safe. There may be some aspects of the culture that your family may be hurt by, or you may be hurt by. And so I want to encourage you, as you're seeking to adapt, to stay true to who you are while adapting. Even though I was going by Pepe Jose, I felt I was still staying true to who I was. But, for example, if someone wanted to call my child by a different name than their given name, and my child did not want to be called by that name, well, we would have to draw the line at that point. So again, we must adapt, but not necessarily sell out. And I know I'm not offering a clear definition what that is, because it's always very contextual and also very related to the personality of the people who are involved. So, Father Gregory Boyle, he said, "Do not go into a new space seeking to make a difference. Go into a new space aware that the space will be different with your presence, as will you." So this is a good reminder that as we're stepping into cultures or congregations with whom we are seeking to evangelize, do not go in there wanting to change them. Go in there knowing that with you there, and that with the presence of the Lord, that people change. And a good reminder, be aware how the culture is going to change you and how God's going to work through them to affect your life. I can't imagine my life, my theology, uh, what it would be like without the influence of the people of La Fundición de Cristo. They made me believe in a much more active and a much more powerful God than the one that I believed in when I came and began ministry with them. But seeing their faith strengthened and broadened my faith as well. So go into spaces not wanting to change, but being ready to be changed and aware with your presence there in the name of the Lord, that community will be changed as well. So now we're moving to part 4, our last part today, about creating a new culture. So first, some words of warning. 1, you cannot lead people into a new future until they believe that you appreciate you can fill in the blank there, till you appreciate their culture, till you appreciate their values, till you appreciate who they are. But the answer I was going to put in here is that you just can't lead them into a new future without them believing that you know and appreciate their past. And we see that with Paul in Athens when he talks, Athenians, I know you're a people of good faith. I see your statutes. He is telling them, I appreciate who you are. I appreciate your culture. I appreciate who you are. And now, let me tell you about this unknown God who I have come to know. So that is a good model for ministering in another culture. So next, you create a new culture only through communicating through the existing culture. Again, that is another reminder. Find trusting cultural navigators. Trying to change the wrong things at the wrong time is one of the leading causes of destructive leadership. So find people around you that you can trust and that can help you lead change. People like who Aaron was to Moses. And I would go so far as to say even the 12 disciples, as Jesus was seeking to reach a diverse community. Find cultural navigators around you who can help us, who are fallible, help us not do the wrong things at the wrong time, such as put out nativity sets in your United Methodist Church in a Latino setting. Starbucks has taught us all a new language. If you go into a Starbucks coffee shop and you sit there and listen to people order, they are speaking a foreign language, a language you only hear in those geographic locations. The story behind that is they started off with a small, medium, and large, and with that, they wanted to call them short, tall, and grande just to be creative. Well, they had to teach everybody that small was short. I still remember going into my first Starbucks and I said, I'll take a medium. And they said, do you want a tall? And that's where I learned the language of tall, communicated through my language of medium. Things changed there when they came out with the 20-ounce coffee, which was bigger than their previous large or grande, which was 16 ounce. And so they just took an Italian word for 20, venti, and now people order a 20-ounce coffee in Italian, saying they would like a venti coffee. And then, of course, the 30-ounce is trento, which is 30 in Italian. But then Starbucks realized they needed a smaller size. And so they came out with a 3-ounce. And they called it the demi, which is not even Italian. Demi is French for half. And I challenge any of you to tell me what the demi is half of, what 3 ounces is half of any of their other sizes. And although it doesn't make sense, if you go and you order a mini double shot chai latte, again, I'm not that fluent in Starbucks language, but they will know what you are are talking about. And the point is, just as Paul in Athens, use the existing culture and language to create a new culture and a new language. But creating a new culture and language is only done through understanding, adapting, accepting, and becoming proficient in the culture that you're called to serve. So, going back to our culture wheel, again, another tool. I gave you 3 tools in the earlier section about analyzing culture, and this was the first of them, and this is the culture wheel. Um, you are now in a position of creating a new culture. That means visiting the vision, mission, and values. And I want to encourage you with your leaders once a year, take time and say, what is our vision? Is this still our vision? How does our vision need to be tweaked? What is our mission? Here are the values we named last year. What are our values today? And these are things you can point to be able to reiterate the cultural aspects that you are seeking to develop and strengthen within the congregation. And it's going to be that vision, that mission, and those values that you are going to seek to carry with you as you enter into a mission field that has different vision, missions, and values. Now, you're going to learn to understand those, you're going to learn to accept those, you're going to learn to adapt those without losing your own vision, mission, and values to get to the point where your mission, vision, and values are shared and come to be their vision, mission, and values as well. Community relationships and programs. As a pastor, there's a lot of time you get to decide how you're going to spend it. With whom are you going to connect? If you want to set up meetings with leaders of not-for-profits, leaders in your community, political leaders, you are able to do that with your calendar. And that's going to be shaping your culture as well as the culture of your church and people you invite into your church in partnerships or to speak. Shape the culture. And I am reminding you of all this to encourage you to be intentional as you're developing this culture. And as this is a course on evangelism, and I'm always emphasizing evangelism, you're wanting to create that evangelistic culture. And so bringing in partners that help you live into that calling is going to strengthen that evangelistic culture that you are seeking to create. What are the stories that get passed down? What are you celebrating? People will say people will perform what they're measured by. And so celebrating those people who have been evangelized, who received the gospel and are able to give testimonies about the impact that Jesus has made in their life and the impact that that church has made in their life and the impact that persons in the church reaching out into the community, the differences that are being made. Those become the stories that shape the identity of who you are. When we talked about analyzing, you want to hear the stories that people share of the past, but you're also creating new narratives through your leadership. Language. You have the opportunity to introduce words into the lexicon. We had a clergy retreat a few years ago, and it was all about being in a liminal space. I can confess before going in there, I'm not sure I'd ever used the word liminal, and I think I was limitedly aware of what liminal might have meant. And it's that space between what was before and what is next, that liminal space between. But now it is spoken throughout the North Texas Conference because it got introduced into our lexicon. At Christ Foundry, one of the ways I was seeking to distinguish us from some of our neighboring churches is a lot of our neighboring Pentecostal churches had the reputation of being very judgmental, judges how you dress, judging what kind of makeup you wear, if men had earrings, etc. And I wanted to create an alternative, a culture at Christ Foundry that did not accept, that did not come to condemn, but came to save and share the good news of Jesus Christ. And so we implemented a rule that we do not give unsolicited feedback within the church. And so that phrase, unsolicited feedback or unsolicited advice, consejo no solicitado, came into the lexicon to where you would hear people sharing it in all sorts of conversations. even in the kitchen, someone would come and say something to someone who was working in the kitchen. They're saying, "I did not solicit any advice," and so it got introduced into the lexicon and into the culture of the church. And it again, it helped shape that culture to be a much more open and accepting church, and that was the culture we were seeking to create. The traditions and rituals that reinforce the vision. I always share at the Christ Foundry, I would reiterate that as the United Methodist Church, we have an open communion table, and wanting to be a very open church among churches that were not known for being open, reiterate that as an aspect of our culture and to communicate that, the open communion table was a great way that we communicated that. In the same way of baptizing infants in the United Methodist Church, I shared that some churches limit God's grace by they don't give communion to children. Others limit God's grace by not baptizing children. And but we understand that God's grace is open to all. And Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." And so we make the both sacraments of communion and uh, baptism available to the children. And I know some people watching this may have different perspectives on that, but I'm sharing the culture that I was seeking to create, which was also part of the theological grounding which I hold and was trained as a United Methodist clergy. What techniques and skills are you wanting to develop within the congregation? And that's having trainings within your congregation to assist them learn how to evangelize, learn how to share the gospel, learn how to do relational evangelism, learn how to do evangelistic events, learn how to incorporate evangelism into existing programs or to turn in existing programs into more community events so that it can be more evangelistic into reaching others. How are you going to prioritize your money? How are you going to handle your money? What other tools and objects and symbols are around your church to reiterate the culture that you're seeking to form? And the same thing with the arts, both in worship, in your different arts program. And the pastors have a lot of influence in these areas and in shaping the fellowship experiences that you have within the church. Giving some priority to although not every event needs to be outward oriented. We see many examples of Jesus withdrawing with the 12 disciples, but assisting your church in a rhythm of withdrawing and being spiritually nourished and then going out and reaching new people. Because so many churches that are so outwardly focused all the time often are lacking a good core of discipleship within them that, again, although many of these churches grow fast, they also crumble quickly. And so we want to keep that core strong. And so to develop fellowship experiences that are keeping your core strong, as well as a rhythm of going out and coming back in, out and in. So a good friend of mine, Rudy Rasmus, is pastor of St. John. He said, "My job, number one, is to be the church's cultural police." And he shares stories about people who come in. This is in downtown Houston. He shared the story about a person who's coming in. They were just being all judgmental about all these people who were on drugs. And he had to remind them, "Hey, that was you just a couple of years ago. And how about you treat them like you wanted us to treat you when you first stepped through our doors?" And so creating that culture, being knowledgeable of that culture, reiterating that culture through signs, through symbols, through activities, through the trainings, through your vision, value, missions, understanding that our job as the pastor is to be the cultural police or the cultural curator. Some may prefer over the police. As you look at this is quite a complex sign. But I'm going to give you some time to look at it. So I want to point out through the left, and we were talking about being the cultural police. And if you look up here to the top, not sure if you can see my arrows, but up here at top, talking about leadership, nurturing cultural values, and that's what that last section was all about. Is the many tools that you have at your disposal as a pastor to develop the culture in your church and to influence the culture outside the church. Again, I talked about visiting your values over here on the right with the glasses, visiting your mission, vision, and values, and making it making it clear and to communicate that. It's interesting that some of the quotes here around there, and I'm going to point out the one down there by the handcuffs that talked about Enron had the values of integrity, communication, respect, and excellence displayed in the corporate lobby. But just because it's written on the wall does not make it integrated within the full life of the organization. And so we talked, going back to that old slide, integrating all of these aspects of the culture you're seeking to create into all aspects of the culture and activities of the church will strengthen it and will bless it and will equip it to reach the greater mission field. So, again, I'm going to give you another second to read some of this. And we'll close with the monster down at the bottom. The famous quote is, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." But this is a correction. Culture eats everything for breakfast. So reiterating the understanding of the culture, adapting to the culture, as well as to be able to create a new culture will be that which will strengthen and will bless both your congregation and your greater community and mission field. So again, going back over these, if you try to create a culture too soon and around the wrong things, you'll be destructive. So seek to move towards proficiency so that it's in that component of cultural proficiency where cultural change and transformation takes place. So this is going to be our last slide today. As you're seeking to change culture, and again, we have that long list of ways to do it, as you're being the cultural anthropologist, learning about it, one of the things you're going to want to listen for is what are those aspects that fall into this top right sector that the church is able to do, able to change, able to implement, but also that there's a high willingness to implement and to change. Again, one of the most destructive behaviors is when persons try to impose their culture into a foreign culture. When pastors try to bring change in too soon or about the wrong things, and it often will debilitate their ministry in ways that many times they're unable to recover, and they do damage with families that sometimes leave the church for good. And so being that cultural anthropologist with an ear towards and an eye towards what do they seem willing to change, and what are they able to change? So creating culture takes analyzing the areas and the seasons in which a congregation is able and willing to change. And I'll give you this example. If we'd have gone in 2019 and proposed to churches, you know what, we need to set up a cell phone in the middle of our sanctuary with a cable run down the wall so we could plug this cell phone into the wall so it doesn't run out of batteries in the middle of service, people would have probably been up in arms and uproar, saying, "Hey, what's this ugly cell phone doing here in the middle of our sanctuary?" Well, the pandemic increased both the willingness of congregations, or increased the willingness of congregations to move into online worship and discipleship. If we'd had Sunday school classes saying, "You know what, we need to add Zoom for people who are not around," probably most would have said, "It's too much trouble." So even though they would have been able to do so, they weren't willing. And we saw with the pandemic, people became very willing to enter into utilizing technology, but they weren't able or not able at the time to implement it. And so generally it's easier to move the needle on ability than on willingness, because I'll invite you to fill in the phrase, where there is a will, there is that's right. Where there is a will, there is a way. And so I will if you see an unwillingness, even though there may be the ability there, I would walk softly. But where you see that there's a willingness, well, then you can equip them to be able to do that which God's calling them to. But when you perceive that there is a willingness and ability, well, there are your easy wins, your low-hanging fruit. And want to encourage you to step into those spaces and and make the changes to the culture that God is calling you into for the new season. So to quickly review before we close out, we talked about cross-cultural appointments or cross-cultural ministries and treating every ministry, every culture as cross-cultural so that we enter into those settings as cultural anthropologists, that we always begin in a posture of learning, a posture of humility, so that we can develop the skills to be able to communicate the gospel. And when we are able to communicate the gospel in effective ways that people can hear and receive, then new cultures begin to be created. So creating those new cultures within the congregation that will then influence the cultures outside the congregations. So I thank you for taking your time. I want to encourage you, comment on this video below. What did you like? What did you not like? What do you perhaps take issue with? Because I too want to continue learning, and I know that through this video, I am reaching many people of many different cultures, and so I want to learn from you as well. Well, God bless you. Know that I'm praying for you, and know that the world needs you. So go forth in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.